Good evening, everyone. My name's Erin Bartram. I'm the School Programs Coordinator here at the Mark Twain House and Museum, and I'm delighted to be joining you for tonight's program. We're so glad to have so many of you here from all over the world. Tonight, we are welcoming Paul Fischer and Dean Job for a discussion of Paul's new book, The Man Who Invented Motion Pictures, a true tale of obsession, murder, and the movies. Before I introduce these guests fully, I want to take a moment to thank our sponsors for this event on behalf of the museum. Our virtual public programs are produced in part with support honoring Frank Lord, a beloved trustee of the museum who passed away in 2020. We here at the museum are happy to honor his memory with these programs, which we know he would have loved so much. We're also incredibly grateful to the Wish You Well Foundation and Connecticut Public WNPR for supporting tonight's program and all our other virtual programs. So one of the benefits, obviously, of this being a virtual program, not only are you joining us from all around the world, but that you, the audience, can have your own conversation in the chat alongside the discussion that we have tonight. And we encourage you to take advantage of that. Many of you already are. We'll also be posting in that chat the link to purchase a signed copy of Paul's book from the Mark Twain store. Now, purchasing a book directly through our store, as opposed to, say, any other large retailer, not only gets you a signed copy, but it also benefits the work we do here at the museum. If you have specific questions as we go on, you can post that in the Ask a Question section. So if you look at the bottom of your screen and click Ask a Question, a little thing will pop up. Please make use of that during the program. We will draw from that in the last portion of our time together. You'll notice it's right below a little green bar that says your support is vital. We really would and do appreciate all of the donations we receive to help make these kinds of events possible and to make more events possible in the future. So if you click on that, you can actually give some support to our public programs here. Every dollar will be put to good use, bringing you more author events like this, as well as a host of other events, both virtual and in person. So now that I've said all that and we're all settled in, let me tell you a bit about our guests for this evening and about a delightful wrinkle that has appeared in our evening. So earlier today, our moderator, Dean Job, lost power at his house, and we have progressively watched the power company say, it'll definitely be on in an hour. It'll definitely be on in an hour. It is not on. I have the questions that Dean was going to ask Paul tonight, and I've done some of the reading of the book in the last few hours. I was able to get my hands on a copy. I think we're going to have a good conversation, and I thank Dean. Maybe he'll have a magical power restoration and join us. But since I'm using his questions and his intro, I do want to give him his due. Dean Job is an award-winning author and journalist and a professor at the University of King's College in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where he teaches in the Master of Fine Arts in Creative Nonfiction program. He specializes in true crime and writes a monthly column on the genre for Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine. I cannot tell you how many times I worried about mispronouncing that magazine's name. It's tongue twister. His latest book is The Case of the Murderous Dr. Cream. It was longlisted for the American Library Association's Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Nonfiction. Dean actually joined us last summer for a discussion of that book, and you can watch that discussion and all of our other recorded virtual events on the museum's website. And we're joined tonight by Paul Fischer, an author and film producer based in the United Kingdom. His first book, A Kim Jong-il Production, has been translated to date into 14 languages, nominated for the Crime Writers Association's Nonfiction Book Award, and was chosen as an Amazon Best of the Year nonfiction selection, one of Library Journal's top 10 books of the year, and one of NPR's best books of the year. Paul has also written for the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, and The Independent, amongst others. In addition to writing, he works as a film producer and screenwriter. His first feature screenplay, The Body, based on a short film of his conception, was produced by Blumhouse and Hulu in 2018. This is the point where I said, take it away, Dean and Paul, and that I will join you later. But now I will just proceed with the rest. So I want to say congratulations, Paul. You know, this book is just out. And having just read a little bit of it, I will, no lie, be reading the rest of it later. Each chapter leaves you wanting to find out a little bit more of the mystery. And so just to frame this for everyone, if we asked you to name the inventor of motion pictures, you would probably say the American pioneer Thomas Alva Edison. But think again. Louis Le Prince, a Frenchman based in a workshop in Leeds in England, was poised to unveil the first motion picture camera in 1890. He never did. Paul's book explored what stopped him from claiming his place in movie history and why so few of us have heard of him. So tonight we're going to explore the answers to these and other questions. And I'll read Dean directly, so Paul, you know what he said. His new book, The Man Who Invented Motion Pictures, is an absorbing tale, elegantly written and brilliantly told, with the plot twists and surprise ending worthy of a Hollywood blockbuster. So for starters, can you tell us a bit about Louis Le Prince? Who was he?
Well, hi, everyone. That's very kind of both of you. And thank you, Erin, for stepping in. Sure. So Louis Le Prince was kind of a self-taught polymath. Interesting because I'm a film nerd and I hadn't heard of him at all until about 10 years ago. And he was one of those Victorian tinkerers who, I think partly because of the culture and partly because he was petit bourgeois and sort of middle class, he had this upbringing where he was kind of primed to do whatever he felt like. And so he studied optics and chemistry. He was born in France in the 1840s. His father was a military officer. And so he went to good schools and he went to study optics and chemistry. And that was more out of curiosity and interest. And then he started apprenticing with a painter and he kind of took up photography because he had a fateful meeting with Louis Daguerre when he was young. And sort of didn't have a focus or an interest necessarily in terms of a vocational career until he met a woman from England called Lizzie Whitley, fell in love, married her, moved back to Yorkshire with her. And the Whitley family were ironmongers. They had an iron forge. This is the height of the Industrial Revolution. They built boilers, valves, all those sorts of things. And Louis moves to England. And, you know, if you can picture him kind of very tall, 6'2", flamboyant beard, French dandy, unexpectedly finds himself really at home on kind of the factory floor doing engineering drawings and technical planning and thinking of this crazy new world of patents where being able to come up with something isn't just kind of a cool hobby or a party trick, but if you come up with something new, you could get legal ownership to it and make a fortune and make your name. And so as a youngish middle-aged adult in his 30s, his 40s, he has several different little careers. And he's looking for ways for all of his interests to blend together and lead him to some kind of something that would be new. And he tries different things with photographs until one day he has a little incident in his shed, in his lab, that makes him realize, oh, if I can make pictures move, then I might be onto something. And from that point on, became obsessed with this idea and became obsessed. For me as a film nerd, in a way that was really interesting, he was one of the first people in that era to not just see moving images as a toy or as a gimmick or as a novelty, but to think and to write in his notebooks and tell his family, this could change everything. If we can, introducing you to my dogs there, if we can capture life and replay it and animate dead people onto the walls and see how people live across the planet, then, you know, the way he saw it, we could end wars, we could end differences, we could integrate people in society, we could entertain them, we could do everything. And so that kind of took over that part of his life.
Yeah, it was really fascinating for me thinking about having in my own research read letters where people encountered their own photograph for the first time.
Right.
What that meant, and then thinking about when does that immediately transition to what if we could make this move? What if we could find a way to move that to turn this into something moving? But I'm glad to hear you talk about the sort of profound approach, because this passage just It's on the second page of your book, but it really struck me about what this could do. And I really wanted to read it because I thought it was a great little bit. Events that could previously only be witnessed once would be available to be replayed as many times as desired. Something that had happened on one side of the planet would be viewable with just a few days' delay by an audience at the opposite end of the world. The past would become available to the future. The dead would move and walk and dance and laugh anytime you wished to see them do all these things again, even decades after their bodies were buried and dissolved in the ground. No human experience, from the most benign to the most momentous, would again need to be lost to history. All of it could be taken, could be received and kept, then reproduced and shared, exactly as it had once been. And I thought it was a reminder, I think, of each of these communications revolutions that someone like Le Prince, or frankly Sam Clemens, lives through in the 19th century. Just what a rupture of possibilities each of these things is. It was a really beautiful passage that made me think what it must have been like to see that for the first time.
Thank you, for sure. And Le Prince was born in 1841, and that was a world of horse carts and most people never leaving their villages, and the season, maybe the day, being the main kind of unit of time that articulated your existence. And then by the time he's 40 years old, people have got portrait photography and the railroad and steamships and an explosion of printed newspapers daily, and rudimentary phonographs and telephones. And in a way, when I was writing, the same kind of technological confusion you might have now if you're say 80 years old now and you were born back in a day when there was one telephone in the village, and now you can kind of track your car on your phone when it comes to pick you up and do this kind of thing. And Rebecca Solnit writes about this really beautifully. She wrote a book about Edward Muybridge, this idea that generation in the Victorian era was progressively kind of breaking not necessarily the rules of physics, but the rules of natural human existence, to where you get the railroad and so you can go faster than you're really naturally meant to go, and you get steamships and you're able to go places in times that you're not meant to be able to make that equation work. And as you say, photographs, people now were able to redefine themselves based on a certain physical image that before that, if you were wealthy, you had portraits, but otherwise there was, a mirror or a looking glass or something like that. And film, I think for a lot of pioneers, was a technological progression, but there were, people like Le Prince who really understood this is going to change a lot about how we relate to the idea of loss and the idea of presence and the idea of connection with one another. And Le Prince was someone who, he'd been in the war, the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, and he'd been in the siege of Paris, which, if people don't know, was essentially a couple of months in the winter of 1870 to 71, where Paris was completely cut off from the outside world. And Le Prince's family were in England, and he really acutely felt that thing of, I have no idea what's happening with my wife and my baby daughter. They have no idea if I'm alive, what's happening with me. Wouldn't it be incredible if there was some way that we could communicate, but also that the enemy could see what they're doing to us? Because this is also the time period where, for the first time, Prussian soldiers can sit 15 kilometers outside of Paris behind a Krupp gun and just shoot it. And you don't have to look somebody in the white of their eye, as they say. And Le Prince had been born in Metz, which is in the east of France, which at different times in recent history then had been Prussian territory or French territory. And he was very conscious of, I happened to be French because I was born in that city in 1841, but if I'd been born in another year, I could have been on the other side. And I think that had a certain impact on him, this idea of, I'm simplifying here, but if you were able to put them on film and us on film, we wouldn't look very different at all. And that would kind of end. There's a quote he told his wife about this conviction he had that no mother would send their child to die in a war if they could see what war was like or see what the enemy was like. And so I didn't expect it, but he was really compelling to me because he had that vision of I know how all these different advancements have changed us, and I can see how this one is going to change us too, which was really uncommon, oddly.
Yeah, to see such social possibility, even as there is this awareness that patenting has economic implications for individuals and industries. And I think it's what's really nice about the way that the book is structured, as far as I can tell, is that really what we're thinking about is both collapsing space, but also collapsing time. This idea that the dead are not truly lost to us. I think of, just the power of having a voicemail from someone who is gone. Now, the ability to hear that voice. And what I've already really enjoyed about the book is the way that you structure the actual narrative, that we start in one spot and we move and it's sort of collapsed from the beginning, and to pick, and I will tell you, this is one of Dean's questions. So it's a bit of a trick question. He said, tell us what happened on September 16th, 1890 at the train station in Dijon.
So on September 16th, 1890, a year and a half after making what we think of as his first motion picture, the oldest surviving motion picture that we still have. So a year and a half after making a movie for the first time, Louis Le Prince is in France visiting his brother. He boards a train from Dijon, where his brother lives, to go to Paris at the end of the visit. And he's planning on traveling back to America to join up with his family, premiere the invention. They've rented a venue. They've got the patents. All the stuff's getting packed up. He's ready to go. He boards this train and disappears. Vanished, gone, is never seen again, is never heard from again. Body is never found. No evidence ever turns up. No complaints are ever made. He doesn't pop back up anywhere else, Martin Guerre style, just gone off the face of the earth. And that's the mystery at the heart of it all, because before he's able to make this public, he's gone without explanation or warning or anything building up to it. Just they put him on a train, they expect him on the other end, and he vanishes.
And the fact that he goes missing has real legal implications for him, for his family, and for motion pictures.
It does. So at the time, at least, I guess I haven't checked how this works now, but at the time, if someone went missing, they would be declared dead if a body was found, or if a period of 7 years elapsed without a body being found. And in that period of 7 years, somebody's property, including their intellectual property, would be frozen. So if they turned up again, everything would be just the way they left it. And so in the case of Louis Le Prince, that included all of his patents and his cameras and his machines. His family weren't able to exploit or make use of them or license them or do anything with them for 7 years, or unless a body turned up. Now, about 6 or 7 months after he disappears, if my math is correct, it might even be a bit less, Lizzie Le Prince, his widow, is sitting in New York, has no idea what's happened to him. And she opens the New York Sun, and on the front page of the paper is a big, bold announcement about Thomas Edison's newest wonder, the motion picture device. And Edison, who had never really in public spoken about moving images, is suddenly announcing, I've got this thing. It can capture life and replay it. And he's talking about it in very much the same words as Le Prince. And the mechanism sounds very much like Le Prince's machine. And as the Le Prince family remember it, it was so striking that they even had friends calling in or dropping in saying, oh, I didn't realize Louis was working with Thomas Edison. That's great news. And so what happens very, very quickly during that 7 years where his rights are frozen is Edison comes out with the kinetoscope, the Lumiere brothers come out with a cinematograph. And by the time they get the rights back and they can declare him dead, which is a bittersweet experience in itself, they still don't know what's happened to him. And it seems to them, everybody else in the world has made millions and taken the credit. And, the horse is bolted. And that kind of compounds why we've forgotten him, because by the time his family can even kind of fight to defend his name, which is a difficult case in the first place, to kind of go, well, my dad invented the movies, but he's gone. That's a tough case to sell in the first place. to sell it 7 years after the fact when you've had thousands of column inches written and people have staked their claim already, it was impossible. Even though they tried, they went to court, did all that thing, which was fascinating. But that played a huge part in kind of compounding that disappearance.
Yeah, and you have some truly wonderful chapter titles, which I'm really excited to get to. And most interesting to me is Thomas A. Edison Can Go to Hell.
Yes, a direct
I'm excited
quote.
to see what's in that one. So essentially, you are digging into a cold case that's over a century old. What's the first thread you pull? What are the archival sources that maybe had been already gone over that you looked at differently, and what are some things you brought into the mix maybe that people hadn't considered before?
There were a lot of things on the French end of things that hadn't been dug through or looked at, or because the few times this story's been kind of touched upon in the past, it's generally been related to England or related to Leeds or related to the idea of Leeds as a cradle of invention and that kind of thing. Whereas there's a lot of Louis' past and existence and continued ties to France that hadn't been touched upon. And I found out going through it, there was also a lot of kind of surrounding circumstantial stuff that hadn't been dug into, in part because, again, talking about technology, it's much easier now when you've got newspapers.com and ancestry.com and emails to email researchers in Dijon to go dig in a church hall than it would have been 20 years ago when you had to, write to people and get on planes and afford all of that stuff. Yeah. So there's a real opportunity to use technological tools to tap into that stuff. But there was also, I felt, there's a sort of myth that's built around the disappearance because Edison announces so quickly after Louis disappears. Le Prince's family became convinced that Edison had him got rid of so he could steal his invention. And so now, or I guess up until recently, if you'd looked up Louis Le Prince, one of the first things you would have found was this idea that he may have been eliminated by Thomas Edison, which is a really, really cool hook, which is one of the hooks we use to sell the book. But it's also meant that a lot of people, I think, and there are people who have obsessed about the Louis Le Prince thing online and on message boards and all that stuff. There's a real pull to want to solve that bit, to want to solve that. Oh, if I could prove Thomas Edison did it. And that kind of makes you ignore all the other potential stuff. And so the way I went about it was I kind of tried to pretend I was one of those gray detectives in a Netflix murder documentary thing. Where I was like, I'm going to reopen it. We're going to go through everybody. This is serial. We're going to hit every suspect one by one. And I was going to really dig into everything and try and eliminate anyone who had ever come close to him in that last year, had any possible motive. And I was trying to apply to it the way you would, I guess, with a kind of prosecutor, this is why I write and don't speak, but a kind of a legal case. Who would have had the motive and the means and the ability, and whose stories aren't consistent. And so a lot of it weirdly wasn't necessarily about investigating that day or Le Prince himself, but the circumstances of everybody else around him. And kind of taking everything everyone says with a grain of salt. A lot of what we know of Le Prince comes from his own papers and the people who worked with him, and a lot of it comes from his wife, Lizzie. And so there's one way to write this where you kind of take those things at face value. And I figured, having written my first book about North Korea, I was kind of coached to not take anything at face value and to kind of not trust anything unless it could be corroborated. And so I kind of went into it with kind of an obsessive, big, skeptical net and cast it wide.
Would you say then, sort of thinking about the way that the question we start with defines the parameters of the historical investigation, sometimes in ways that are blind us to possibilities. Do you think the question you started with is the question that you end up answering? Did it end up changing what you as you went? Did the goal of the book evolve?
Kind of, in the sense that So I first heard about Louis Le Prince, or read about Louis Le Prince, there's this big, thick conspiracy novel by Theodore Rorschach called Flicker, that I read on a plane or train journey once. And it's kind of like, it's the Da Vinci Code for movies. And it kind of weaves in real life figures, and it mentions Louis Le Prince in there. And it's kind of, as I remember it, this sequence of, well, the guy who made the first movie was eliminated. Suspicious. And I remember reading it and going, that sounds real. Is this one of the real things? I've never heard of it. So I looked it up, and, what was fascinating to me then was Le Prince's films exist, and the patents were granted, and the camera exists, and the projectors exist, and there's really no reason not to just consider him the first. And so my original question was, I understand he disappeared. I understand that would have clouded things at the time. But in hindsight, if the National
They didn't burn his
Science
workshop
Museum,
down or anything. All of his stuff's there.
If the National Science Museum in Bradford in England has all this stuff, then that should be history. So my kind of starting question was, if all of this is true, why is he not remembered? And I was kind of fascinated by how we write history, in a sense. And the one I left by the side of the road very quickly was he the first? Because you kind of realize that's meaningless, because you have to define what first is, right? He was the first to have a patent, but does that just mean if you don't have a patent, but you've done it, it doesn't exist? There's an English researcher called Irfan Shah who kind of says about Le Prince, if you make a movie but no one buys a ticket to it, does that movie exist? Because that's kind of one of the criteria for Edison and the Lumiere brothers is, they had paying screenings, which is kind of capitalism seeping into our sense of history without us realizing. So I set that one aside very quickly. But by the end, what I was really interested in is, why should it matter that we know about Louis Le Prince beyond he happened to have a successful technical test X amount of months before anybody else? Because there's not much meat on that. It's a trivia question. And kind of what I fell on and what I really like about the world this takes place in is our whole concept of invention and progress was changing away from people like Le Prince, away from this is kind of available to anyone and you can tinker in your shed and the world is your oyster, into kind of Thomas Edison's world, which is R&D departments and JP Morgan money, and unspool that for 100 years and let me introduce you to Elon Musk, really, which is really just the exercise of money and marketing. And so that kind of underpinning to the true crime thing became really interesting to me.
Found, having been, I worked in the National Park Service in New York City years ago, and one of the things we all had to do was Edison Days. So when the Edison site has a huge thing, kind of like our Tom Sawyer Days, and basically everybody from all the parks all around have to go and help out that day. And it truly is, it is a sprawling campus. It is building after building. And this guy working in his little workshop down the street from his wife's family. It really does. It's a reminder, I think it's so much in this period, we tend to think things flipped a switch and things changed, but the sort of persistence of older ways alongside these new things, and how quickly, it sort of very slowly and then all at once methods change. And I really thought about thinking about time, that pause where no one knows that he's gone.
Yeah.
Where there's an absence of evidence there. No one is gathering or asking, if you're thinking about it from the perspective of the detective. And then there's this second pause. And the whole, a lie is down the road before the truth has its pants on. That this feels very much like, not even the creation of a myth, the creation of history, but the creation of a narrative. And people are like, well, we have a narrative now. That's done and dusted. That's fine. And we can handle other facts that don't fit, and that won't disrupt the narrative. So learning that he's the first, as you said, doesn't, that replaces something in the Guinness book, maybe.
Yeah.
But what can we learn about his struggles as an innovator? What does it sort of help tell us about this moment? And does it help tell us anything about early film more broadly, beyond kind of the technical stuff, which is also very cool?
Well, it's a tough one, right? Because it's, his struggle. So he was part of a kind of whole group of different pioneers who were only kind of dimly aware of one another. And they all did things for different reasons. And they all benefited from other people inventing things, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you get situations where Louis Daguerre invents photography, or invents the daguerreotype, and then he donates it to the French government, to the French people, who make the technology essentially public for everybody. They don't enforce it as a public property. And so people experiment with photography, and that leads to Edward Muybridge, who was an English photographer, managing to take an instantaneous photograph. So when we think of those animated horse at a gallop, that's Muybridge. They're really illustrations from photographs, so they don't count as motion pictures, but that's Muybridge connecting together the first pictures that you could take in an instant. And Muybridge does this, and he publishes the pictures in La Nature, which was a science newspaper. And so there's a French scientist called Juliette Marais who reads about it, and who says, "Oh, I'm studying birds, and I'd love to learn about this." And so Le Prince had kind of come into this world where there was a kind of openness to progress, and people wanted their patents, and they wanted to benefit from specific things they'd invented. But there was also this idea that, if you take a step forwards here, I can take a step forwards on top of that over here, which, kind of culminated in terms of motion pictures with, around 1888, everybody who's trying to make a moving image is stuck, until a couple different people in the United States come up with this thing called celluloid, which they figure, oh, we can put that on a film, and then suddenly you can do a lot more. And so in a way, even if you go, did Edison invent movies? Did Le Prince invent movies? It doesn't really matter, not possible, unless, the Reverend Hannibal Goodwin over there patents a celluloid strip first. And that was all going out of the picture as this was happening, because there were people funding inventors like Edison who were depending on accumulating intellectual property the same way they accumulated capital, the same way that robber barons were eating up land with the railways, the same way that banks were piling up cash. Edison, who I often sound like I think the guy was awful, but he was like a genius, and he was great and all these different things, but he also represented invention as a commodity, and this idea that instead of it being, the English kind of had this through the Industrial Revolution, this idea of patenting an invention as the guy whose family have been ironmongers for years and years and years, and the generations never left the factory floor. If you invent a specific kind of boiler or valve or something, then in one generation you can go from that to funding the local college and running for mayor and living in a big house, and you can kind of raise yourself to a different level. Edison, because he was so prolific and because he was so tied up with bigger corporations, kind of set the tone for a different concept of invention in the United States particularly, which was, if you can keep on inventing things that you own and others don't, then you can be way ahead of them. And that's one way to kind of circumvent competition.
Yeah.
And the movies kind of, after Le Prince disappeared, played out to be one of those cases where Edison and his lawyers tried to assert that he didn't just own his camera or own his projector as the law essentially held it, but he owned an entire medium. And it's interesting that, you still can try and invent something in your garage or whatever, but you're going to have venture capitalists on it in a second, and there's certain amounts of capital you need now. And that was kind of all born then, this idea that to have a certain success and a certain reach, stuff had to be vertically integrated and really dependent on distribution and money.
Yeah, it's interesting thinking about, you mentioned sort of the robber barons, but there's this brief moment of robber barons that really shifts then into the corporation with
Yeah.
the face and the guy out there. But thinking, I never really thought about something like Edison's workshops, the alienation of the workshed tinkerer from his labor, that the intellectual property you create as a wage laborer in one of Edison's shops belonged to the corporation that is Edison.
For sure. And this plays into this as well, right? Because when we say Edison, even the thing Thomas Edison invented, Thomas Edison did not invent. So even the kinetoscope and the kinetograph were developed and invented by a Scotsman called William Dixon. And William Dixon worked for Edison. And in a very modern way, it was just understood that was a work for hire kind of thing. In the same way that whatever you draw on Disney campus is a Disney character, or whatever you see on the internet about that stuff. Whatever you invented in the Edison lab was something Edison had invented, and that was kind of a new idea. But there was a generation of young people like Dixon and like, the Prince was a bit older, but suddenly all these people who might have been tinkerers who were like, actually my dreams to work with Edison, people like Tesla who came from quite far away, who were like, I've heard about Thomas Edison. And the as I was researching Edison and writing Edison, the guy who reminded me the most of was kind of a Steve Jobs kind of figure, in a sense that he was the face of a business that's closely associated with his own personal brand and figure. And at least in the second half bulk of his career, did no inventing or fixing on his own. That thing about Steve Jobs that, he couldn't code to save his life. But in the same way that Steve Jobs came out every year and went on stage, Thomas Edison went to the newspapers and announced the future. And he had his char coat the same way Steve Jobs had the turtleneck. And, the people who funded Edison were funding an R&D department and constant progress and constant new stuff, but also whatever Edison embodied, that he was very conscious he embodied. And was one of the reasons he chased movies, because he was kind of on a losing streak and needed something new.
Yeah. And just so you know, Paul, we lost your video again, so I don't know if you can come back. We had a little trouble with this, but your audio came through just fine. We may.
Just going to toggle it on and off, see if that helps.
All right. Well, I will ask my one more question, which actually kind of dovetails really well with what you were just talking about, and then we can take some questions from the audience. One thing that really struck me, I'm reading this and I'm thinking about I'm thinking about connections to Sam Clemens. Within a few pages, we get the fact that he marries into a family of means. Not that he didn't come from means, but that he sort of marries into a network. And one of the things you're talking about here is kind of dismantling the myth of the singular genius that we might impose on previous things, and thinking about that even when Edison invents something, Edison didn't invent something. But I wonder if you would say that there is something to be learned here by adding history of the family into these histories of innovation and invention in the 19th century.
I think so. I think because the context is really, really important, right? Like I can't make sense of anything Le Prince did or came up with without also having the context of these are the people who worked with him. This is how his wife was able to feed the kids and send the checks and finance him. Yeah. And this is the kind of marriage they had that, even made this sort of thing possible, if that makes sense. The idea of departing from the family firm, something he was only able to do, not because of who his wife was, but literally because she encouraged him to do so, and encouraged him to think of life as something that you could kind of pull up and start somewhere else, because they lived in England and they lived in America and they had this openness to reinvention. which all ties into being, Western white and middle class as well, which like there's reasons they could do that and the education they have and all of that. And so, like, again, it's one of those things where we really like clean and vivid stories, and we've kind of trained ourselves to value stories of individual overcoming or triumph, which I think is leaving us at a real spiritual deficit now, at a time where the last thing we need is that, but we need to actually figure out how to do stuff together. But that's a whole other thing. But invention, we kind of treat that way. There's a need. And also, and I think about this a lot in relation to this and other things, the way we conceive of genius. I'm fascinated by how genius comes from genie, and it's meant to be this thing that works with you. But we've decided it's this thing that some people, mostly men apparently, because that's what the narrative wants us to believe, have, that makes them different. And so Thomas Edison had to be this colossus, and everything else is just kind of biography and not strictly about the invention. Or the Lumiere brothers were considered the inventors of cinema in France. As the story goes, it came to one of them on a stormy night in the middle of a migraine, a very Frankenstein-y story. Because we need this kind of individual power behind invention. Not that we need it, but somehow that's how we've written history. Or that's how the system's written history. And you asked earlier about one of the things that changed as I wrote this, and it kind of started out much more sprawling, where I was going to write about Le Prince as kind of the linchpin of a bunch of different pioneers. And then my agent, Jenny Hughes, and Emily Graff was my editor, Simon Schuster, both were kind of like, well, the thing is, it's not about him or them, it's about them as in him and his family. And if you write about them, that's going to be interesting and vivid and present. You don't need, essentially what I was doing was trying to have a little Avengers cast of mini geniuses, because I was also thinking that's what invention is. It's these guys toiling away in the dark as opposed to ecosystems. There's another thing that we lost away from money is ecosystems to do all these different creative things. And so I like being able to read about invention and history, where it's not just about guy at desk has genius brainwave. You can't do anything with that, and it's not usually how it works.
It's not terribly inspiring as a person who's trying to do anything if those are your models. We note at the museum, Sam Clemens wrote his things often up in Elmira, where his wife's family was from, and I sort of point out, like, he did the editing, the hard stuff, the long laborious stuff, back in Hartford. And I think one thing that was really, really great about this, and that actually kind of makes the mystery more compelling, is if he weren't embedded in these networks, your cast of suspects would be smaller. In many ways, this is all about networks. And as you admit quite early in the book, that some of this is just luck, and not luck as in I had a sort of flash in the dark, but my dad happened to introduce me to this person. We were set up in places to make that happen, and then it did actually happen. And I found it a really, just from the bit that I've read, a deeply fulfilling thing. There are lots of threads and people that you want to know and kind of trace out through the book. And it's such a refreshing way of thinking about a period that does tend to be about, was it this guy or was it that guy? And you're like, well, it was all of them, and also dozens of people you didn't even know about.
For sure. And it's really cool because you're right. Invention, usually we write it about the people who've been recognized as inventing the thing. We write about that one person who crossed the finish line. And there's actually a lot to mine writing about, well, let me tell you about these guys who didn't quite make it. And kind of paint our vision of how stuff works if the only narratives we get are the narratives of the guy who made it out, the guy who made it rich, the guy who made it famous. Because that's not most people experience. That's not how it works. And so, I'm fascinated from a narrative point of view by people who have something kind of on the tip of their fingers and then lose it, because that's, I don't know, some kind of emotional exorcism. You got to go through reading it or writing it. And Le Prince was really interesting because, as we said, everything is there. He should have been the guy that you go, this is about the man who invented motion pictures. But it actually didn't happen. And so you're kind of writing about him and a generation of people who are forgotten, but you're also writing about the success, which is a really cool kind of duality to write about. And to write about that context, to go back to that first point, the other thing is that thing of individual doing it on your own thing. It's also just always proven false, like it's that cliched thing of like Walden Pond. Oh yeah, his mom did his laundry. Of
His mom did
Edison.
his
Oh yeah,
laundry.
but everybody worked, like everything. Bezos started it in his garage with a massive loan from his parents. Everything has a caveat.
I was thinking of Bezos and Gates and the discourse around their divorces. What did these people even do for them?
Right.
Who cooked Marx's meals while he was writing Capital and all this kind of stuff? Yeah.
Right, which really comes to play here because, like, Le Prince's wife, from all the evidence we have, quite literally funded him. Yeah. And it's very glamorous to think Thomas Edison funded by JP Morgan and Louis Le Prince working hard in his own little workshop. But it's more truthful to think Louis Le Prince funded by his wife, who gave up quite a lot, who had opportunities to be one of the first teachers at Stanford when they started it, and who kind of turned everything away to delegate herself to this other person's dream. And that also plays into a lot of narratives and invention. There are so many people who need to delegate their own ambitions to somebody else's. Whether it's the people who worked with Le Prince, who thought of themselves as inventors in their own right, but now worked for this guy, whether it was his wife or his kids who put everything on hold for him. When you decide your whole life is going to be about one thing, then you're also deciding that whatever part of that life you should be giving to other people, you're not going to give them. And someone's going to have to fill that gap.
Yeah. That's a really profound point. And something, if there haven't been enough hooks already in this discussion, something that anyone here who is a fan of Sam, who knows something about how this, American novelist genius worked, and the importance to him of his own wife and her contributions, both financial and intellectual and emotional. If that kind of story works for you and is compelling to you, this will absolutely be the same kind of thing. So I cannot wait to actually go finish this, because so many things have been set up. I'm really looking forward to the rest of it. And I'm glad that I got, even though it was not maybe the way we would have expected it, I'm really glad I got to chat with you about some of this. There's some questions here that folks have dropped in the question section. If you have more, feel free as we go along. So Keith asked, and I know you do get into this in the book a bit, how does Le Prince's sort of specific design compare to Edison's and the others that kind of come after?
Sure. So, and first, apologies if you still can't see me. I can see myself and I've toggled on and
We're
off.
good.
So
I can see you.
Oh, brilliant. I'm glad I wasn't picking my nose or anything. So I guess, Keith, the interesting thing is all these designs were quite similar, but the thing that set Edison apart, the kind of big picture thing that set him apart, is, at least in those early days, he either hadn't thought of projection or he had no interest in projection. So when Edison announces his kinetoscope thing, it's a peep show device. It's a cabinet with goggles on the top. You put your face up to it. You watch stuff kind of on your own. And that was a pretty massive difference, because Le Prince was obsessed with projection. He designed little sketches for something he called the People's Theater in his notebook. That we have a picture of those diagrams in the book, which is a cinema. That's basically what it is. And in terms of the inner workings, because they were all dealing with the same problems, which essentially was, before moving pictures, if you were taking photographs, you were taking them on glass plates or paper strips of emulsion, of chemicals. And to get moving pictures, you had to move those through the machine 10 or 12 or 15 times every second, which leads to a lot of shattered glass and a lot of ripped paper, and the light you're putting through the camera making everything catch fire. And so celluloid eventually comes along, but it fits photographic cameras, not film cameras, because film cameras aren't a thing. People are inventing them in their own little workshops. And so Edison's machine and the Prince's machine essentially had celluloid cut in different ways. So we talk about 5mm film, that's because that's what Dixon settled on as his picture, as his image, and that stuck. And Edison's image, Le Prince's images seem to have been square. And Le Prince used metal belts that he would slot the film into to run through the camera and projector. Dixon and Edison used perforations on the sides. Le Prince's thing was able to move, probably 10, 11 frames a second. Edison's, by the time it came out a couple of years later, was moving a bit quicker. But fundamentally, they still had strips of celluloid film going from one drum to the other, past the lens, would stop very briefly behind the lens, and then keep moving, using, hooks or perforations or whatever it was to make it move along. And the thing is, that wasn't that nefarious, because there was 5 other guys working along essentially the same thing, because like a funnel, them all having the same problem kind of led them down the same path. Not that you're suggesting was nefarious, but Le Prince's family were convinced it was.
That's interesting. And that's a good reminder that when we think about invention, we're not just talking about objects. We're talking about ideas. Like, I had this moment of like, why would you not think to project something? And then like, well, why would you think to project? That wasn't a thing. So why would you have thought to do that?
It wasn't a thing. There was also a whole debate about, like, can we make more money charging each person for every minute that the goggle box, or will we make more money? And so this is kind of only touched upon in the book, but it wasn't until after World War I that movies were in a dedicated space on a big screen for an extended period of time. And it was really economical reasons, as opposed to any kind of highfalutin vision or whatever. But the people's approach is really interesting. Edison and Lumiere brothers came to it as like, it's a gadget. This will be a great gadget. Le Prince had the vision. Jules Marais, who was the French scientist, physiologist, he wanted to take pictures of birds in flight and then figure out how the wings moved. And so he couldn't point the camera around. And so he fitted a rifle so he could load the film in the kind of reservoir with a gun and just point it and shoot. And so there's one chapter, one of the titles you might like in there, that's called I've Invented a Gun Which Kills Nothing, which is what he wrote to his mom. But he came to that because he wasn't interested in actually making the pictures move. He just wanted to get them in movement so he could break them down. And so the differences in how they got to the end result were all because a lot of these pioneers had kind of different aims and goals, but they had to deal with the same set of problems. And that was the cool thing. I can't do anything with my hands, but writing this, there's a series of books for kids, the kind of Ada Twist scientist, Iggy Peck architect. There's one about Rosie Revere engineer that I'll read to my kid. And that very simple thing of invention that's in those books, of like, you've got to embrace failure. Every time you fail, you're getting somewhere. It's just coming up with something new is literally just failing until it doesn't fail anymore. Like, really what Prince and all those other guys were doing was exactly that. It was try something, it fails, fix it, and make something else fails. And that made it really understandable for me, for instance, because I don't have a technical brain. If I'm on a film set and the DP explains how the camera works, I go to my happy place. But I'm able to come to grips with this.
Excellent. All right. Well, we have a question here from Beth, which I think is kind of interesting, given our conversations about networks and ecosystems. The people who worked for Le Prince, his workshop, his associates, did they ever sort of pursue these patents, pursue Edison, try to do their own things, or was he too much of a behemoth by that point that they couldn't quite tackle?
No, so they tried to help. So Le Prince's main right-hand man was his son, Adolf, who was a teenager when they were working together. And Adolf was fascinated in chemistry, wanted to be a chemist. And so when Le Prince had lived in America and left America to go back to England to do the work, in part because his father-in-law still had an old space he could use and a place he could live. And in part, it seemed because he was pretty paranoid about people in America stealing his invention. The one person he kept with him for a while in the family was Adolphe, because Adolphe wanted to learn more about how this worked. And so when the 7 years had elapsed after Le Prince's disappearance, by a roundabout set of circumstances that's detailed in the book, the Le Prince family had an opportunity to have their day in court. And so Adolphe traveled back to England to meet the old crew, get the evidence, and essentially get sworn testimony from them as to what happened. And then, Le Prince's team was really 4 people. It was him, his son Adolphe, this man called Luc Longley, who was a mechanic in the Leeds area, and another, just out of his teens, carpenter and joiner called Frederick Mason, who just lived down the road. And Le Prince liked these 2 guys, put them on salary, brought them in, got a workshop, and they called themselves investigators rather than inventors. But they worked together for a few years. And as the years went by, as Longley and Mason got older and couldn't afford to travel and had health problems, what was fascinating was they kept writing into the newspapers every time they saw something about Thomas Edison or Phil, going, actually, this very fine gentleman that we worked with, I saw the pictures projected here and there. And it's the only instance in this whole thing that I found where there was no dispute over credit. Edward Muybridge had court cases against Leland Stanford, who had funded him, who was one of the robber barons, because they disagreed over credit. Jules Marais' assistant left him because they disagreed over credit. Edison and Dixon fell out in a gigantic way because they disagreed over credit. The people who worked with Le Prince went to their graves very publicly and very forcefully saying, no, this guy was a genius. It was all him. We were honored to work with him. He should be remembered. I was there. Can someone please remember I was there? Which fascinated me. And I was really lucky to be able to find some of their descendants, again, through the magic of ancestry.com, and bring them to life a little bit, like Erin, in the way we're talking about, again, ecosystem and kind of the environment. Like Le Prince was a polymath who learned stuff on the go, and he needed what these 2 guys knew to make any headway. And if you go see Le Prince's mahogany camera and projector, like, it is Mason and Longley who built them and who cut them and who did all the everyday work. And so I really wanted to kind of bring them to life as people as well, and not just kind of footnotes, kind of to reverse mini Edison dynamic, because that didn't serve.
I mean, that is a deeply meaningful thing that says an awful lot about this person and the workshop that they ran. And this reminder that if these things were invented by single people in the dark of night and no one saw any of it, when this happened, there wouldn't be anyone left to say, no, I saw this happen. I was a part of this. This is important and it should be remembered.
Yeah. And again, the capitalist thing, they can go, I saw it happen. But really the answer of historians was, well, do you have a receipt? Do you have a stub? Do you have... Because otherwise it doesn't.
Did anyone take a film of it happening? Picture it didn't happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. This is a really wonderful story. And Judy has asked a question, which we will not answer, which is, so what did happen to Le Prince? I think we know the answer here is, well, it may be the journey as opposed to the result, but also you'll have to read the book.
I will say one thing, which someone reminded me of earlier. It does say murder in the subtitle of the book for a reason. That's not an overreach, if that's a hint. Right.
Yeah, well, it's right there. So here it is. It's in little letters, but it does say murder. It does say murder. Alrighty. Well, thank you so much, Paul, for spending this time with us, and thanks to everybody here for spending the evening with us. I hope Alice has dropped in the chat the link to get your signed copy through the museum store, and I hope that you will take advantage of that. If you joined late or you want to go back and rewatch, you're in luck. All of our virtual author programs are posted on our website and available to watch whenever you want. So if you want to watch this one, give us a few hours in the morning to get it up there. But feel free to revisit this. And thanks again to Dean for giving me the framework to use for this conversation. Couple of events I want to draw your attention to. If you're local, we have a really cool book talk with an author next Tuesday, the 26th at 7. We'll be talking to Hugh Howard about his new book, Architects of an American Landscape, which deals with Frederick Law Olmsted, who I was just thinking of when you mentioned Leland Stanford, and Henry Hobson Richardson. So that's at the museum itself. And then the next night, Wednesday, the 27th, we have another in our virtual Clemens Conversation series, Mark Twain in the Margins, which is a great program with our assistant curator, Mallory, that explores how Twain talked back to the authors that he read in the margins of their books, sometimes with rather spicy language. So that's a great program, and Mallory looks at a lot of really great stuff from our collection. So this and all of our other virtual and in-person events are on our website, marktwainhouse.org/events. And I will also say, if you're around, come visit us at the house. We're open 7 days a week, and we'd love to see you. You can see Mark Twain's own invention, or at least investment and failure, the Page Compositor, right in our museum center, and learn and talk a bit about Twain and his fascination with invention as well. So
That's
thanks
brilliant.
again to everyone. Yeah, it's
That's brilliant.
and me and our curator, we do a series for children called Catching Up with the Clemenses, where we answer sort of questions about what it was like to live in the past, and trying to explain changes in printing technology for a grade school audience is a challenge we have been working on this week. So you can come and see the 18,000 piece Page Compositor in the Museum Center. So anyway, thank you all for joining us this evening. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening. And thank you again to Paul for spending this time with me.
Thanks so much for having me, and for, again, stepping in with no warning.
Yeah. Excellent.
Thank you, Erin.
Have a great night.
Thank you, everyone.